Welcome everybody to another iteration of Intersections. I'm John Kao, 50% of the hosting function at the show. My partner and co-host Brian will be joining us at the top of the hour, but necessity is the mother of invention. So you've got me and our distinguished guests until the top of the hour, and then Brian will join us then. So welcome to Intersections, which is our weekly conversational jazz club and jam session that is looking at the intersections among technology, culture, and innovation, but most especially looking at the intersections among a really diverse group of guests who we've been privileged to host since last August, and we now have a lead stream going into the summer. So we must be doing something right because the campfire is attracting really interesting people. Let me quickly introduce myself and also Brian. I'm going to be very brief about that, but I think the one-liner that I'm most proud of is that the Economist called me Mr. Creativity and a serial innovator a while back. I've been a Harvard Business School professor, and actually apropos of our show today, and this is a little sidebar for our first guest, I got an MD and did a residency in psychiatry because I was really interested in how human behavior issues took flight in business. Not because I thought people in business were crazy, obviously, and I've done a bunch of other things. You can follow me on LinkedIn, and you can, if you're interested, I write for Forbes.com, and I've got a bunch of columns now on everything from national security to what we can learn from jazz musicians. Brian Solis, my co-host, is the global evangelist for innovation at Salesforce. And by evangelist, I really mean that he puts ideas out there as a keynote speaker and a best-selling author, serial author of books, and also someone with an amazingly diverse network of people that somehow dovetails very nicely with my own network. So the repartee in the show is one of the big attractions for me to show up every week, and also most importantly to have the opportunity to share this time with all of you. We are in the process of launching a newsletter, and meanwhile we have our web site, which is the archive, where all of the videos are there to be seen from previous shows. They're quite evergreen. These are mostly interviews that are not about current events of the week, but statements about the longer term trajectory and contours of what's going on in our very rapidly evolving and somewhat confusing world. So Intersections Live is a good place to check in if you want to follow up. And of course, feel free to follow Brian and myself on social media for up-to-the-date opinions and mouthing off. So with that, we have two extraordinary guests today, and it'll be interesting also to think about the juxtaposition between them. But let me first introduce Emma Seppälä. You will look her up, and actually you'll see in her ID there double umlauts. I asked her earlier about Finland, which, because the double umlauts are a giveaway, but she tells me that her early childhood experience was actually in France, although she had a Finnish grandfather. So already we know that she is an intersection of sorts, but she has an amazing background. I can't wait to dive into the subject matters. She's science director of Stanford Center for Compassion and Altruism Research and Education, which is a mouthful in and of itself. She's the author of a very interesting book, which I have on order, Emma, and I'm looking forward to reading it, called The Happiness Track. And this is very much about bringing clinical science to bear on the world of affairs. She's also co-director of the Yale College Emotional Intelligence Project, and does work at the Yale School of Organization and Management on women and leadership. So Emma, what a background. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, John. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you. Well, I think we'll make a meal out of your subject matter, because I'm keen to get into it. Also from, my medical background is a number of years ago, but it never leaves you. And really, I did the residency in psychiatry at Mass General so I could get the behavioral science frame of reference to look at these issues. So Maybe tell us a little bit about, first of all, about your work with particular reference to the happiness track. What is it, and what are some of the headlines about it? Why is it particularly timely right now? I think it's probably obvious that we're in a somewhat stressful time, but as I think you point out in one of your pieces on your website, there is a difference between stress and anxiety. And let's just jump in. So what's the happiness track about? What should we know, and why is it especially relevant right now?
Well, I wrote the happiness track because I just saw how the way that we're approaching success and trying to, and work in general, is just not really working for us. There's this misconception that in order to be successful, you have to somehow put your own well-being on hold. And actually, if you look at the research, it's totally wrong. And first of all, we're seeing something problematic in the workplaces. 75% of the US workforce is disengaged at work, as you probably know. And there's 50% burnout rates across industries. And this is pre-pandemic. So something we're doing is not quite working. And so as a psychologist, I was really just looking at, well, what makes someone more focused, more creative, which John, I know you know so much about, more charismatic, what makes someone more able to attain goals in a successful way. And if you look at it, actually taking care of your own well-being is critical in order for you to be successful over the long run. If you have short-term goals, that might be different. But if you want to, in a sustainable way, achieve your goals while also, managing the rest of your life, doing so by taking care of that internal well-being is key to thriving and to resilience. And I think the pandemic has only further made that clear. I mean, we are surrounded by stressors that we were not anticipating, and it's many people are not prepared for that.
When you look at business leaders overall, this is not a scientific question, but what percentage of them do you think actually practice self-regulation and have a good handle on their internal emotional and psychological landscape? I mean, would you say it's the majority, the minority, none, all? What's your impression based on being out there with your framework?
Well, I think it depends. And I think that what we do know is sort of the old school model of like run yourself ragged, be really stressed, and be kind of an asshole with everyone. That's not something that's going to be acceptable anymore over the long run. We also know like Generation Z, and so they won't stand for that kind anymore. Like it's not an option anymore to learn how to regulate yourself. And then I do tend to meet more leaders who are leaning towards a self-regulation piece because they're interested in this topic. They have worked on themselves, and they're very self-aware. And I really think that's the leadership of the future, because that's long-term sustainable leadership, right? The others will eventually often drive themselves or others away, or drive themselves into the ground. And there's a win-win here. Learning self-regulation, learning emotion regulation, self-awareness, cultivating greater compassion toward the people you're working with, that's actually going to benefit a leader too. So
when you cover Stanford and the Yale School of Organization and Management. I taught at a well-known Eastern business school for a while. Do you think that management education is doing a good job of teaching emotional regulation and emotional intelligence along the lines of what you're talking about? Or do you think this is a field that is still a promissory note in terms of, helping people to reach a desirable level of these proficiencies?
John, I think that's such an excellent, astute question, because I think the memo's getting out there that, positive leadership is best. Those are the leaders that get the best results. And so what's being taught oftentimes is lots of tools and techniques to become a positive leader. Do this, say more of this, do more of that. Here's the problem. We register inauthenticity very fast. And if you are not authentically doing that stuff, it's going to backfire, because we actually register inauthenticity as threat. Let me give you an example. Let's say someone's feeling angry. Let's say I were feeling angry and I were not to show it, and I'm just not going to show that emotion, right? Your heart rate would increase. You wouldn't know why. Maybe intellectually you wouldn't know why. Why am I feeling sort of uncomfortable right now around this person? But your body has already registered something inauthentic is going on and it's registered as threat. We've all had those moments when we're around someone and we just don't feel quite comfortable around them, and we don't intellectually know why. But it's like an internal signal. And that's because we're so physiologically connected to one another that inauthenticity doesn't really work. Lies will only work for a short duration. So the truth is, it's great to learn lots of tools and techniques for being a positive leader. But, unless you actually deeply and honestly become a person who is truly driven by that integrity, that empathy, also from within, it's not really going to work over the long term. So I would say business schools are really trying hard and they're teaching a lot of tools and techniques. But if we are not careful, those tools and techniques can turn into manipulation, which will backfire because the truth comes out.
Right. So I'm reminded of what my own studies in jazz are a parallel. You go out and initially you want to learn riffs and tricks because that's what you think is going to get you to the point where you're going to sound convincing. But riffs and tricks and effects are inauthentic and only get you so far. They're really not about expressing your inner truth, so to speak. So
interesting.
It's only when you get beyond that your music begins to sound good. And I think the problem with a lot of management education, whether it's cases or reading, the 10 principles of X, Y, and Z, is it's not experiential enough. And, therapy is experiential change at a deep personal level that is about getting to authenticity. There is no analog for a lot of the behavioral science and psychological interventions in education right now, but it needs to be experiential, at least in my opinion, which is why, as you say, people have gotten the memo, but they can't necessarily fully deliver on the promise of all of it. So you said one thing that I wanted to, I'm especially eager to follow up on, which is this notion that you feel something in your body when someone is being inauthentic, or, your intuition translates into a shift in heart rate. And I noticed in your writing that you make a distinction between psychological disciplines that are about cognitive reframing versus disciplines that are about the body. And so, just for everyone out there are clearly a lot of psychological interventions that have to do with, self-talk and the whole cognitive behavioral therapy tradition, right? Mm-hmm. But you're talking about something that actually operates at the level of your experienced embodied self. And especially, I guess, around breathing and this sky breathing system and stuff like that. So tell us why attention to the embodied self is so important, how you maybe made the transition from valuing cognitive to physical, and what the sky breathing system is all about.
Yeah, on a personal level, I was in New York City during 9/11, and after that day at 8:30 a.m. every morning, I had this sort of uncontrollable physiological anxiety response that no amount of talking my way out of. And I think anyone who's experienced anxiety or trauma in any manner will notice that and cognitive behavioral therapy is very effective for many people. And yet when there's really intense sort of physiological response with the emotion, it's challenging, almost impossible to talk your way down in that moment. In fact, we know from the level of the brain that usually, our prefrontal cortex will help us with rational thought and reasoning and sort of talk down those emotion centers. But when the emotion centers are firing really strongly, you actually get sort of a deactivation and you lose your ability to think rationally. And I think we've all experienced that in moments of strong emotion. You can't talk your way out, and it's even less helpful if someone shows up.
Your executive functions kind of melt away.
Yeah, right? It's even less helpful when someone shows up and is like, why don't you just calm down, right? So there had to be another way. And I was really interested, and for my own self, I noticed how breathing was really very transformative. I learned that the sky breathing was being taught to people after 9/11 in New York City. And so anyway, I went on and did a PhD in psychology and did some research on different things, meditation, social connection, and so forth. And then later during my postdoc, I became really interested in the trauma that was in helping veterans coming back from Iraq and Afghanistan with trauma. It was really big headlines in the news around the fact that, there was just so much suicide, as there still is. And what the research showed was that, well, the traditional routes, therapy and pharmaceutical approaches have a very, very large limitations for this population. I mean, 50% of veterans who actually go through the entire treatment don't get any benefit at all. And then there's many who drop out and so forth, and many who don't want that kind of treatment. So we thought, well, we don't have anything to lose. Let's try this total physiological approach. You don't have to think about anything. You don't have to talk about your trauma. You don't have to take any drugs or feel dependent on any therapist or pill. You just breathe. So we ran this study, and we found that after 1 week, so the group of veterans that had gone through the program versus those who did not, after 1 week, their anxiety was normalized. So you could send someone to massage for every day for a week, and they probably would feel better. So we wanted to see, well, what happens 1 month, 1 year later? Mm-hmm. And we found that 1 month and 1 year later, their anxiety was still normalized, suggesting sort of this acute healing process of sorts. I don't like to use the word healing, but normalization, I would say. And so that was really intriguing because it was surprising to have the results. It lasts so long, and also after 1 week. And so down the road, now I've joined Yale. Now this is like 10 years later, and I was invited to run a study on well-being here at Yale for the undergrads, who are another form of really stressed, high functioning, but also high burnout, high anxiety, and so forth. And so we looked at 3 different interventions over the course of a semester, when usually we see high burnout levels. And we wanted to see, okay, what happens if we do different wellness interventions? So we had the students randomly assigned to either a control group that received no intervention, or a mindfulness group that received, the traditional mindfulness-based stress reduction has been well researched, an emotional intelligence group that received a lot of cognitive training in emotional intelligence, and then a SKY group, which is really the focus on the breathing. And, while all the groups benefited to a certain extent, the breathing group had way more impact than the others. And again, I think the reason is that when you approach the physiology right away and calm the physiology, then you sort of get the mental health benefits of a calmer physiology. And it's a little counter to the paradigm that we've been in psychology, which has been all about use your brain all the time, cogito ergo sum, I am what I think, But yeah, we have a new paradigm to also think about.
So this, and I looked up the SKY approach. You do it over a weekend, or there's a workshop, and you can do it over a video, and it's a technique, right? You have to do the workshop. You can't buy the book, I guess.
Oh, yeah, no, it takes a few days to learn. So I couldn't describe it in the book, but yeah, it's offered various ways. So for veterans, it's offered at no cost through a nonprofit called Project Welcome Home Troops. And then for the general community, they can learn it through a nonprofit called Art of Living. There's a college course, which is what we did for Yale, which we used for Yale, called Sky Campus Happiness, I think. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting. I'll relate it to my studies of music, which have been a bigger and bigger part of my, my later years here. And I made a transition fairly recently from improvising only with my cognitive faculties, so what goes with what kind of mode I'm playing in relative to what harmonies in the left hand, and so forth and so on.
Yeah.
And it was only when I started to internalize the pulse of the music and focused exclusively on rhythm for a while and embodied the music in my physiology, because rhythm is built into breathing and heartbeat and all that stuff, that my playing began to transform.
Wow.
This notion of kind of moving from the cognitive to the physiological is, I think, very interesting and relevant in a lot of different situations. The other thing I'll point out for our audience is that what's really, I think, especially striking about what you're talking about is that, we customarily think about, well, breathe deeply, or, get Andrew Weil's breathing tape or whatnot, and it'll help stress. And stress is a kind of a transient phenomenon, whereas anxiety for many people is built up over a long period. They may have anxiety that goes back to childhood, or if they're a veteran, their post-traumatic stress syndrome may have had its origins years in the past. So this is actually getting at much deeper seated issues on a more sustained basis, or at least from what you're telling us, which
Mhm.
makes it an even bigger deal, it would seem.
Yeah, John, I just love your analogies to music. It's a world I don't know enough about, but it's just so fascinating to hear your experiences. And really, I mean, we live in a very disembodied world, at least in our societies. I would probably not in all societies and all cultures, but in ours, we're in a very head-centric sort of society, a head-centric education, head-centric everything, right? And so just thinking even just about our ancestors or other peoples in the world who actually have their feet on the ground. Like when do we have our feet on the actual ground, right? So it's just, we really have so much to benefit, I think, by adding a more balanced approach to whatever it is that we're doing. And so your example of music is so good, but also for mental health is what we're finding. And I'm sure for many other things as well. I'd be really curious to learn more about that.
Sure. Well, happy to discuss that at great length, because I'm living it right now. I mean, I think if you reflect on what business and governance in general has been about, it's been about the analytical, and the the industrial model is very much about quantification and analysis, and even thinking about, well, how do you get into business school? You take the GMATs, and you show how smart you are in analytics, and you learn how to analyze cases and so forth and so on. And none of that is embodied. You sit in rooms that are, reasonably comfortable, but there's nothing physical about any of it. And so the learning occurs, if you believe in the theory of multiple intelligences, your learning in a business pedagogical environment occurs in a very narrow band, right? And then think about all the other possibilities. Howard Gardner talks about spatial and kinesthetic intelligence and visual intelligence and things of this kind. And so what you're saying is that there's almost like a physical intelligence that needs to find a way to be expressed, which certainly conforms with my own experience.
Definitely. And I would think even for emotional intelligence, that you can show up and say a bunch of stuff, but if your body's not admitting, you can pretend to be a very warm and welcoming person, but if people are walking into your vibe and they're just feeling ice cold, like the confusion is there. We do have so much physiological resonance. You can't really, and I have to say, I have a colleague who is writing a book called The Embodied Mind for us to look out for. Annie Murphy Paul. Yeah, I've just got her galleys and excited to read it.
Interesting. So what's your prediction for us? I mean, inevitably we're coming out of this era of pandemic, and clearly mental health has been a much bigger issue for all of us, or for many of us, being shut in and isolated and fearful, and having death kind of surrounding us in the form of these invisible viruses. And then you have the rise of telemedicine and telemental health and so forth and so on. I mean, what's your prediction in terms of how it's going to affect the place of mental health and these kind of helping interventions in society? I mean, is that something where we're just going to go back to baseline, or do you think, as with many other areas, this has kind of changed the game board a bit?
I think it'll be a combo. I think that we've learned a lot of things that we can do a lot of things without getting on a plane or without, and I think it'll help a lot of people who can't really move around, like maybe the elderly and stuff. So I think it can be, I think it'll have had its learning benefits for us. And at the same time, obviously it has had some huge challenges, notably for young people who have not been able to socialize, high school students. I mean, the suicide rates are, troublesome, really troublesome. We need each other. Social connection is one of our greatest human needs, and not just virtual.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of social cleanup that's going to be needed. And as you say, I guess having the virtual be another modality that is now more familiar and more grooved in is going to be beneficial. I mean, there is some evidence that people are more truthful with on a virtual connection, or even talking to a bot, than talking to another human face to face. So, maybe they do the heavy lifting of getting things started, and then the human comes in to pick up the pieces. Who can say? Well, I know that you have to go in just a moment. I think this has been a great conversation. I certainly look forward to the opportunity to maybe relate some of the musical landscape to what you've been talking about. Is there anything else that you'd like to say or share with our audience right now before we say bye-bye?
Well, I would I guess, just on the topic of earlier of leadership, I would just say that, one of the most important things we can do, and especially not just leadership, everyday living, is to learn how to regulate our emotions, especially because, like the pandemic, we weren't expecting it and we were already stressed beforehand. And then this big stressor came, and have we learned how to manage the state of our mind? So the quality of our life depends on the state of our mind, right? You could be having a sunny, happy day outside, but if your mind is unhappy, it doesn't matter that you're in a beautiful environment.
Right.
Similarly, you could be locked up at home and lonely, but if you're happy on the inside, it doesn't impact you as much. So being able to really take care of that really determines our ability to be happy, but also to connect and to be successful in our endeavors.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that because I taught at Harvard Business School for 14 years, and we never talked about happiness. The unwritten assumption was that if you were really successful and made a lot of money, then happiness would follow, as opposed to happiness being the thing that would actually enable that feeling of success and wealth in personal as well as or instead of financial terms. So
it's so true.
Even the notion of the Happiness Project, which is the title of your book, which I'm now track, which I'm now extra curious to read, tells us that there's a place for that kind of happiness learning in, what we would normally associate with being the world of affairs and business leadership, serious stuff. That it's fundamentally important. It's
so true. I'm part of an alumni Facebook group for Yale College, and somebody asked the questions. One of the moderators asked the question, what do you do professionally, and what would you advise to someone who wants to do that profession? Okay, simple question. You wouldn't believe the answers. Answers poured in, and they weren't at all answering the question. They were saying, I am this, or mostly actually physicians and lawyers, many physicians and lawyers, and basically saying, don't do this, don't do things for money, don't do things for power, don't do things for glory. And they didn't even answer the question. They were just saying that this was their profession and how they regretted having sort of lived their life for this, prestigious job. And then they're looking back on their life as an alumni, 20, 30 years later, thinking, what did I do with my life? Right. And I think we forget that in sort of this aspiration for success. It just go, go, go. And then people turn around later and are like, wait a second, did I get my priorities right? And I think, so yeah, there is a way of still being successful, but also having lived a life that has been fulfilling.
So better to have that thought process happen when you're in your 20s as opposed to your 70s.
Yeah. And that's actually why I wrote my book, because I was in Silicon Valley, in that vibe of go, 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 achieve, 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 get more, get more. You're a successful entrepreneur, be another successful, do something, you know what I mean? Yeah. And ambition is great. It's innovative. It's fun. It's exciting, but not if it's at the cost of you, your life, your health, everything, right?
Well, on that note, thank you so much for being here. This was a great pleasure.
Bye.
Good luck. Bye. Gregarious. Oh my. Well, I think you can sign off, Emma, and I will kind of figure out what's next here.
Sounds good.
It's a new raw medium, so we're always reinventing it every time we do the show.
Okay.
Well, let's see. I'm here, and I don't even know if I have a producer, let alone a co-host, and I don't know if I have a guest. So, we do have a guest. Hi, Bill. How are you?
Good. Hi, John.
Welcome to the show. I should take a moment to introduce you to our audience here. Brian, my co-host, is going to join us in just a little bit, but as your invitor, I would be kind of conducting a lot of the conversation anyway, at least in the beginning. So I've been looking forward to talking to Bill for ever since I picked up his book, which is The Death of the Artist. And it's so timely because as we think about intersections, the show as the intersection among technology, culture, and innovation, Bill's thesis, which we really want to get into in some depth, is that there's been essentially not just a mutation, but a kind of a sea change in the way art operates in relation to society, and that technology and new business models are at the heart of it, and not always in a positive way. So Bill has done so many things. I almost don't know where to begin. I mean, he's written other books, an interesting one for sure, entitled Excellent Sheep, The Miseducation of the American Elite and the Way to a Meaningful Life, which I can only assume he accumulated thoughts about because he's been associated with some elite institutions, having taught English at Yale, my own alma mater, and Columbia, before becoming a full-time writer approximately 12 or 13 years ago. He's spoken widely. He's visited, guest taught widely. He's received numerous awards and written in many, many different formats. So it's a real pleasure to have him on the show because of this multifaceted perspective he brings to this question of what is the fate of the arts and the artist in this extraordinary time. So, Bill, welcome. Finally.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me on. And let me just say, before we get into the new book, that Excellent Sheep relates directly to what you were talking about, especially in the last few minutes with your previous guest. I mean, she was talking about Yale undergraduates. Those were my students. And the whole issue of how do you avoid getting in the situation that those doctors and lawyers were in 20 years later, where they regretted their choices, is exactly what Excellent Sheep is about. But that's the last book. We're here to talk about the death of the artist. So let's do that.
Well, but before we do, I mean, so when you say that it's about that kind of wild strawberries moment of looking back and regretting because of the inauthenticity of your life, what did you discover, and how did you then resonate with what Emma was talking about? I mean, let's just.
Well, I mean, I was dealing with students at that stage where they were still deciding what to do with their lives, often having very little idea of how to even go about deciding what to do with their lives, because the whole system that gets you into Yale is about doing what the grown-ups tell you to do and doing it very well. And when you get to the end of college and realize for the first time in your life that you need to actually start finding your own direction, many of the students that I had, many of the students that I've heard from since, and I've heard from hundreds, if not thousands, don't know how to go about doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I was one of those Yale undergraduates. And of course, I just, after college, did what my father told me to do. So my life was, I'm being somewhat facetious because I spent much of my life kind of undoing that advice. But, we all have to.
Me too. Yeah. Me too, John. But if I can segue in a sort of unexpected way to the new book, the people I talked to, and I talked to about 140 people for this book, mostly young artists, people under 40, they are the exceptions to what we were just talking about. They don't follow the herd. Mm-hmm. They often ended up doing what they're doing against stiff resistance from family, from school, from peers, from society. Everybody tells you you're crazy to be an artist. These people are heroes to me, artists writ large, because of that, because of the sacrifices they make, because of what they bring to us with their creativity. And we don't treat them very well. Mm-hmm. It was bad enough before the internet came along. It's really bad now.
So what is the crisis of the arts in a nutshell? You talk about the death of the artist, which is pretty grim title. What's going on?
Yeah, I mean, the title, of course, is a bit hyperbolic, but it is accurate if we understand it in terms of the death of the middle class or mid-tier artist who could sustain a career of creativity at a manageable level of financial sustenance, right? So basically, yes, it's always been hard to be an artist, but before the internet came along, if you're one of the relatively few artists who managed to achieve some level of success, not superstar, not famous, but just become one of those regular professional mid-tier full-time working artists, that was a middle-class life. We had built structures in the country, especially after World War II, that enabled that to be a profession. And in a nutshell, what happened is that the internet came along, starting with Napster in 1999, which gave us unlimited free music, which we still have, and cut the legs out from under that business model. And now the typical mid-tier serious career artist is having trouble keeping their head above water. And that's the crisis. And it affects all of us.
Well, what are the implications in terms of, I mean, the arts have always had a particular place in society. Oh, hi, Brian. How are you?
Hello.
Hello,
Hello, Bill.
Yeah, Bill, meet Brian. We're just talking about why this is important vis-a-vis the role of the arts in society. You know,
Sure.
so I presume you have a point of view about what the role of the arts in society has been,
Sure.
and now what is mutating into, both in terms of the economic downward pressure, but also maybe there are some new mutations that we ought to be talking about as well.
Right. So this is not about how new art forms are arising or decline, or old ones are declining. Of course, that's true. Of course, the internet has opened up all kinds of new avenues and maybe closed off some old ones in certain ways. This is more fundamentally about how we understand the arts and the role of the artist in society. I would dare say that for most of us, we have this assumption that the artist's job is to speak truth to power, to tell us things, to tell us new things, maybe not even speak truth to power, but just speak truth to us, to sort of tell us things that we don't know and maybe don't want to know, to tell us uncomfortable truths, to kind of be the leading edge of consciousness. And I think a lot of people think that that's an eternal fact about artists. It is not. It arose in the 18th century. It arose in conjunction with the free market, because it was only then that artists were able to free themselves from patronage, which meant you do what your patron wants you to do. You know, your patron is the church, your patron is the king. You don't freelance in terms of what you say what they want you to say. So with the rise of modernity and freedom in many spheres of life, financial life, but also mental life, it's then that the artist begins to assume that precious role in society of being kind of the leading edge of consciousness, the truth tellers. That is under threat now. It's under threat because of the economic pressure that the new conditions created by the internet and other things, but mainly the internet platforms, have put artists under. Artists now, on a scale that they have not had to do before, have to constantly please the audience, have to maintain constant contact with the audience. They're basically like businesses. I mean, that's what they said to me. We're like one single person businesses, but they're also like businesses in another sense, which is that you have to keep the customer happy. You can't say anything that's going to offend anybody. You have to stay in tune with the conventional wisdom, because if you defy the conventional wisdom, you're committing economic suicide. So that is what I'm very concerned, and I see this already. I'm very concerned we are going to lose in the arts, and the artists are not going to play that role for us anymore. They're going to be entertainers, or they're going to be essentially under the ideological control of whoever their patron or audience happens to be.
It's really interesting what you're saying, because it almost sounds like you're associating that notion of the artist as the truth teller and antenna in a way for where things are going with a kind of a liberal Enlightenment social reality, right? Because, you know, if you look at the function of the arts in from an ethnographic point of view in early societies, or you look at the role of the arts in autocratic societies, you know, the artists make stuff either because they have a vision or because, you know, somebody tells them to do it, either the patron or the dictator or the Communist Party or whatever. And so this notion that the artist is creating this kind of space for consideration of values and, you know, is an expression of freedom and democratic thought is really, as you put it, a symptom of modernity, right? And so now, and at the same time, there's always been like this conflict between the true artists in cinema versus Hollywood, and the independent playwright off Broadway versus Broadway itself, right? And the kind of commercial incentives for kind of pleasing the audience, for being Mike Nichols,
right.
who managed to make a few serious statements while raking in the dough and keeping people happy. But you seem to be suggesting that the space for that kind of risk taking and China breaking and voicing of unpleasant truths is really shrinking because the business model that supports that is shrinking.
Absolutely right. I thought that was all very well said, including what you said about the relationship between the quote unquote true artist and the culture industry, Hollywood or the big publishers or the big labels. I don't see the culture industry as evil. In fact, that's one big way that my point of view changed as I was writing the book. I think there's a really productive tension to be had between a culture industry that is in contact with a mass audience and can get things out and can fund things, and the independent artist who's inevitably sort of chafing against the constraints of the culture industry, but it's a productive tension, and it's been a productive tension. And if you look at like the golden age of Hollywood in the 70s, that's what was going on.
Yeah.
But it depends on the ability of artists to kind of approach and retreat from the culture industry as they need to. It depends on that sort of margin of financial security that allows you to sort of be a bohemian or a quasi-bohemian. And the problem now is that that's not possible anymore. We talked about the internet that's severely cut revenues, and we also have to talk about the cost of living. That's the other big piece of it. To be a bohemian means to live cheaply and maybe have a part-time minimum wage job and make your art. You can't live cheaply anymore. I mean, rents have skyrocketed. Tuitions, most artists do some form of higher education. Tuitions have skyrocketed. Healthcare, the minimum wage continues to lose value in real dollars. That's the other side of the problem. The other side of the balance sheet is also the problem.
So just to circle back for a moment to this question of how, let's say, the kind of cultural corporations are playing into this. I mean, I suppose you could argue then that, even Disney might say to itself, well, we produce a lot of, Marvel Universe stuff, but we also did Soul, from Pixar, which has a big moral lesson. Or, you look at Netflix, which is clearly investing in edgy documentaries and things of this kind.
Right.
So if that kind of, I guess, moral or cultural conscience can filter up to some of those C-suites, that's probably, well, I don't know, you're smiling, so probably.
No, I agree with you. I mean, it's good if that happens. I think, I don't think that's that can't be the only place for it to happen.
Right.
But yeah, that's right. I mean, again, there are lots of valid negative things to say about culture industry players like the Hollywood studios or the labels. They do tend to push artists in commercial directions, but it's a complete qualitative difference from the tech platforms, because who are the ones who are the real problems, who are really dominating this now. Because even Disney or Universal Music has to invest in artists, right? They don't make any money if artists don't make any money. The platforms don't invest in anybody. They just say, put your stuff on our platform. You probably won't get any money for it, but we're going to get tons of money by monetizing the traffic that you generate for us.
Well, and also because we're going to control the relationship with the audience, which I think, right? I mean, so Spotify basically, I don't buy the album of, I don't relate to a specific artist. I relate to Spotify, and Spotify tells me what to consume. And, the incremental cost of, learning about a new artist is zero. I'd much rather have their taste on my head than have to go out and figure out what I like. So it's kind of an invitation to inauthenticity at the consumer level in some respects.
Yes.
So what's the answer, or what what's the remedy? I mean, you know, I have.
John, we can't get to the remedy yet. We can't get to the remedy yet. We have to hold that to the end because there are some other things that we have to throw into the mix.
Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
Okay, well, Brian, go ahead.
Because this is really interesting. You know, you're talking to somebody who before I had two choices in life when I was young. I was either going to be a famous rock star or I was going to be a computer programmer. And I was taking up both equally at the age of 7, learning how to program and learning how to play guitar. And now we look back to what the idea of, say, music was back into those days, because I'm old, versus what it is today. And it makes me wonder, what if we look at, what if we look at artistry in terms of a renaissance, like the shift between, let's say, silent movies to talkies, and not everybody made it their way towards the new generation of Hollywood. And if we look at, say, VidCon, the conference that is for the creators of all of these new platforms who are making millions and millions and millions of dollars creating, their version of art, maybe not my version of art. How do we see then artistry not necessarily dying, just taking on a new form, but also how do we see that as an opportunity as artists to evolve into the new era of talkies and adapt what we do to today's new ways of earning revenue?
Yeah, I mean, there are always evolutions in art, like the move from silent to talkies, that are going to leave some artists behind and create new opportunities. I'm talking about the financial foundation of all of this. We can always point, and this is what the people who are the boosters of this new art world, basically Silicon Valley, that for now 20 years has been saying there's never been a better time to be an artist, which is complete nonsense. But their argument is, well, you can appeal directly to the audience on our platforms, and that's why there's never been a better time. And they always hold up the examples, the famous people who, Chance the Rapper, who won Emmys before he had a label deal, or the person, I forget her name, who wrote 50 Shades of Grey, didn't have a publishing contract. These people are literally 1 in a million. So we can hold up the big mega successes, but that is not what's going on for artists. That's just the lottery winners. In fact, another aspect of the internet arts economy is that the big winners get bigger, and everybody else gets less and less, right? It's all shifted up to the blockbusters. So a lot of what I talk about in the book is how artists are adjusting to the new era. I mean, the truth is that the question I came into the book with was exactly that question. Not, is it harder now? It was obvious to me that it was. But given that it's harder, how are artists managing to survive? And I profile a lot of people in the book, and to one extent or another, they're managing to survive. Some of them are doing pretty well. Some of them just barely surviving. So it's crowdfunding. It's all kinds of direct audience engagement. But again, it's really hard. And also, all of that direct audience engagement basically means that you have another job that you have to do. You're an artist. You're waiting tables to make money, probably. And then you have to be this one-person business who's constantly on the platforms, literally mailing your CDs, say, out to your end users and so forth.
I used to do that, yes.
Yeah. So there's also, the hustle, you were talking in your last segment about burnout. I think the burnout of Ivy League students is nothing compared to the burnout of the artists that I talk to, because it's endless, and they're not making a lot of money. It's this endless hustle, and they're still just barely surviving.
Yeah. Well, and then to your point, you have this almost this reverse game with Patreon, where you have Jack Conte, who actually I met Jack because I found his approach to artistry very, very innovative with him and his significant other and other friends who had formed Pomplamoose, who were doing these wild YouTube videos that just sucked me in. The next thing I know, he's on Sand Hill Road, pitching this idea to help fund artists like him. And that became Patreon, which has grown substantially ever since. How do you see? I mean, that's certainly one way What are we not thinking about in terms of helping to reimagine revenue streams for the future?
So Patreon has been really helpful, and the other big one for artists is Kickstarter. One myth that I need to dispel about those platforms is that they've solved all problems. They haven't. They're good. I mean, all of the young artists I talked to were involved in one or the other or both, but they're not panaceas. In terms of imagining new revenue sources, you're talking to the wrong person. I'm not a creator, and I don't have that kind of imagination. But what I will say is that people are doing it. People are trying all kinds of different things. And I think this gets back to John's question before. What are the solutions? I mean, I think there's some big solutions that go well beyond the arts economy. Most importantly, dealing with the tech giants, breaking up their monopolies and regulating their platforms so there's a more equitable distribution of the money being generated by those platforms. Just the way we need to regulate them like utilities. Other big solutions have to do not with the arts at all again, but with making life livable for everyone in the middle class or working class. Dealing with things like health costs, higher education costs, and housing costs, and raising the minimum wage. In terms of the arts, it isn't one big solution. It's lots of solutions. I think, our public funding of the arts is ridiculously small. It's actually less than, at all levels of government, it's less than $1.5 billion. That's like $4 a person at all levels of government. I think a consumer movement like we have had in food, where we say to people, you need to be a more responsible consumer. You need to pay a little bit more so that the world is a better place. You need to understand the economy that you're part of. And with food, it's, the animals and the soil and the farmers. In the arts, we've taken this free music, free art, free text, free journalism thing for granted now for 20 years. And I think we need to be more responsible as consumers and recognize that we have to play our part. I mean, I quite frankly think that there's been a pretty general decline in the quality across the arts. I mean, there's certainly exceptions, but it's just kind of all of this mediocre stuff that people are constantly churning out, because constantly churning stuff out is the only way to survive now, because you're getting so little from each thing you produce. So those are some ideas. We can maybe talk about others.
So when you say the total U.S. government expenditures on the art is $1.5 billion
at all levels of government.
Oh, so federal,
state and local. The NEA is like 160 million.
I know, it's astonishing when you think about the amount of money that's sloshing around in the system. I mean, that the Pentagon spends $2 billion a day on our national defense.
Yes, and three times more for bands, for military bands, than for the NEA. But it's not just how much money is sloshing through the system; it's also how much money the arts are generating for the system.
Right.
I mean, the arts are a very big sector, and they generate huge amounts of tax revenue, but almost none of it comes back.
What about, so you mentioned that, well, what about the role of philanthropy? What about the role of the billionaire patron class? What about CSR money, corporate social responsibility stuff? I mean, my sense is those have dried up some, but remain potentially, I mean, when you think about somebody getting a MacArthur grant, that is supposed to free them up to be adventuresome and not beholden to the market, right? And they for the relatively modest amount in relative terms that the MacArthur Foundation puts out, they get a very big return. I mean, it's like 100 plus young expeditionary thinkers every year and so forth and so on. But I mean, are those models that can be improved on, you think, or?
Well, I think they can be improved on. And yes, while I don't have numbers on this, what people told me across the arts when I talked to them is that philanthropy seems to be shifting its funding away from the arts, because there's this new idea or this newly emphasized idea of social impact, and people think that the arts don't have a social impact. I think the new generation of philanthropists tends to be less sensitive to culture than earlier ones, people who, like Carnegie, who built libraries and museums and so forth. Right. So I think philanthropy can do a lot more I don't want to rely on philanthropy for the same reason that I don't want to rely on philanthropy to fund our schools and keep our parks open.
Right.
To me, this is a big problem that now we rely on billionaires for social goods instead of, in my view, raising taxes on billionaires significantly and spending the money on social goods that we all agree are important. MacArthur is great, but what do they fund? Maybe a dozen artists a year out of their award winners? I mean, it's like Peter Thiel giving, 20 students a year, sort of the $100,000 thing or whatever he does. It's 20 students.
Right. Well, it makes him feel pretty good, I would imagine.
I'm sure it does.
Yeah. I'm just. Oh, I wanted to ask you. So you've spent a lot of time and energy getting ground truth on what this crisis or this kind of the situation of the arts is. What do you see yourself doing to storm the barricades? I mean, the book is obviously a great contribution, and your willingness to be on venues like this speaks to your desire to, get the word out. But is there more? I mean, or could there be more? Because, there are relatively few people that see things as clearly as you do.
Well, listen, for me personally, I think my best ability to contribute is to write and to speak. I'm not like I said, I don't have an imagination to sort of imagine new solutions, and I'm not an activist. I'm not that kind of personality. Since the book has come out, I've reached out to a whole bunch of organizations, and some have reached out to me, and I'm trying to help them do their thing. And as a result, they're groups of musicians that are organized to have a fairer music economy. There's a big group called Creative Futures that started in film and television and now includes all the arts. Creative Future that's trying to deal with issues of copyright and piracy. So, and there are more and more groups now as a result of the pandemic. We haven't talked about the pandemic. The pandemic has been a disaster, and not even just in the obvious ways. I mean, all artists now depend on live events, including authors, because live events are something you can actually charge for. So, this is what I see my role as being. I'm not going to like found a nonprofit. That's not the kind of person I am, but I'm working with people who have.
Well, and it sounds like you're a clearinghouse in a way for a lot of what's going on, because your book has become kind of like a visible lighthouse. And so I can imagine, simply being a curator of what is actually happening and keeping us informed with short form pieces, and however that shows up would be immensely valuable. Because that you just mentioned three things that I have not heard of, and I'm very involved with young musicians. I feel I advise them on their careers. I know them. I see their challenges, and I'm personally trying to figure out some solutions for that segment. Mostly experimental music and jazz, which are the most underfunded of all, right? So so you just mentioned a bunch of things that I hadn't heard of. It seems to me that if I understand you're not going to storm the barricades, but maybe showing us where the barricades are and continuing to do that would be really valuable.
I certainly plan to do that. I have a piece about the pandemic's effect on artists that should be coming out in Harper's in May, in the May issue.
Oh, great.
And I just put up on my website, actually, a page. There's a button on the homepage of resources. So it's a list of those organizations that I was talking about, a whole bunch of them, and I'm going to keep adding to them as I hear about them. So there are 4 or 5 just for musicians, so you can look at those.
Yeah. So the internet is not all bad.
I actually say that in the book. This is not about whether the internet is good or not.
Yeah.
It's just about whether the internet has been good for artists' ability to make a living.
Sure. Understood completely.
Okay.
Well, I think we're at the bottom of the hour. I can't thank you enough for being on the show. We've been looking forward to this for months. So, and it was inspired by my seeing your book and buying it and reading it and having it kind of inflame my brain. I know Brian shares my point of view about the need for innovation in this area. So the book is a great source of inspiration.
Thank you. I'm so glad to hear that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you for writing that book and for all you do. And even every essay. I think the one thing that we can all hope is that people are inspired by your work to the point where they take the charge, they take the torch, and they go change the world.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much for having me on, guys.
Thank you, Bill.
Ciao.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Hey, John, so you're going to hear a little Maltese yapping in the background. It's been that kind of day, and thankfully she just started barking. That means she's woken up from her nap. So with that said, I'm going to, it looks like Gregarious might be on a call, so I will bring us up here and
here we
even
are.
out our, there we
reunion
go.
Within the reunion. We had a really nice interview with Emma, which you can see on intersectionslive.com.
And that's a good segue, everybody, that you could tune into past shows on intersectionslive.com. We have a newsletter. Oh, we're so close to getting this thing in motion. We just hired somebody this week who's going to help us get this thing off the ground. Is also going to help us do a quick refab on our intersectionslive.com site so that you can read more about previous conversations, because to be honest, John, I know you feel the same way. So every conversation that we've had, even from day one, is probably as or more relevant today than it was then. So you're not going to waste any time going back to the catalog. In fact, you could just think of this as binge watching your favorite Netflix show. John, thanks for holding down the fort. For those who are wondering why I'm in a bow tie, I was hosting an event for Salesforce, and the theme was the Roaring 20s, because we are in the 20s, and trying to bring that optimism out for everyone. John, any insights today, and anything you want to take us away with?
No, I just think they were two very satisfying interviews. Onward and on to the next ones.
All right. Well, with that said, then please tune in every Thursday at 10:30 a.m. Pacific. We go till 11:30 a.m. Pacific. Please reach out at Brian Solis, John Ko. You're going to see us on Clubhouse as well pretty soon. We've got some great plans, all of the things that we need to move forward on. With that said, then we'll see you next week. And also, please feel free to reach out in between shows with ideas or questions or comments. We're here for you all the time. Thank you so much.